started. My name is Marty Lexman, probably superintendent of the school district. And you won't hear a lot from me during the presentation. I'll do quite a bit of Q&A part of this. But we're committed to making sure we start on the right spot. I'll do just a couple of introductory slides here, and then I'll turn it over to the experts. This is Aaron Norris, our incoming Director of Finance and Operations. He was just approved last night. And he's now in 2 jobs, officially, and also the Manager of School Services. And this is Steve Eichmann. He's our Manager of Facilities. We also have Noah Lee, the Board President, is here. Amy Deal is here from the school board as well. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing a little bit of your time with us this evening. So you can go ahead, Aaron. Next one. So our focus is really to share information, respond to questions related to proposed school consolidations. Right? And in particular tonight, we're focusing on Lane as being one of the schools that's going to be recommended for consolidation. And also to talk a little bit about the impact if the board approves that, and to say if a number of times here because the board hasn't taken action yet. Our job is to do the analysis and to make a recommendation. Their job is to make the final decision. But if the board approves the consolidation of Lane, then there's some impact in FLW as well. So we want to touch base on some of those things as well. This will be about a 30 to 40 minute presentation. We're going to ask you to hold questions until the end because we believe that a number of questions will be asked or will be answered during the course of the presentation, but we'll certainly have enough time for questions and answers at the end. We're really committed to beginning and ending on time, sharing information really focused on Lane. But if there are questions about the other schools that are being considered for consolidation, which are Longfellow, Madison, and potentially another elementary, there's been a lot of conversation around Wilson. But we're happy to answer questions. But the majority of the focus on the presentation will be Lane. We want to really listen and learn from one another. You may ask questions and we'll be like, oh, we haven't thought of that. That's come up a couple of times. And that's helpful in the process of kind of opening the conversation in the community. We're respectful of differing opinions. This is incredibly hard to have to face the fact that for us to operate efficiently for the long term, you really should have fewer schools, right? That's a reality. And it is a difficult set of recommendations in the decision the board will ultimately make. But there are differing opinions on that. We have to respect that. We're really going to focus on questions related to this topic. We're not here to talk about other district matters, right? So that we're really focused on the school consolidation tonight. We're not going to go over time. We advertise this as 6 to 7. If we need to extend the Q&A a little bit, we want to give you enough time to answer questions. But the crowd is not huge, so I think we'll probably get to your questions while you're here. You can follow along so if you want to scan that, there's additional information. Amanda is our Director of Communications. We're also recording in live stream. So this will all be available after the fact. If you have friends or neighbors like, oh, you should have come to that, it will be available electronically as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron. He's taking it from here.
So as Dr. Lexman said on the handout that Amanda has, you can scan that. That'll take you right to the presentation. A lot of the slides that specifically Steve will show tonight are kind of hard to see. Actually, you're a little bit closer than most of the schools we've been at, so maybe you will get a better visual. Your phone, you can literally go through slide by slide. You can zoom in and out to look at some of the analysis yourself if that's helpful. So that's something to, if you have that, then you can take that out, that'd be great. But this map, to me, is the best visual of kind of like where we started to where we've come to today, right? So the bottom left corner, I have a laser pointer, identifying the needs. So anytime anyone has like a potential problem, hypotheses, you want to start out by identifying what that is. And Dr. Lexman framed that by saying we have fewer students and the same amount of schools that we had 20 years ago. So the first thing we did is we identified that as accurate. So that led us to looking at enrollment projections, and Steve will talk more about that in a minute, but going through and confirming that even though right now we know that school is that forecasted and projected to hold true, right? In 30 years, what do the birth rates look like? Where do we come from? Where are we at today? Let's confirm that our enrollment projections are accurate. And then that led us to looking at a long-range facilities master plan. So many organizations have these new facilities, looking at what are the needs coming up for just like you do with your home, right? Planning for, we have a roof project coming up in our house, and things like that, you plan for those, and try to make good predictions about what will come in the future, which led us to our FACT committee, which was a group made up of facility staff we have, administrators, teachers, parents, students, and community members that looked at all the information from our enrollment study to the long-range facility master plan. We worked with the Gray Architects and C.G. Schmidt to do the analysis of our schools and where their CIP needs are, and Steve will really get into that. But this roadmap allowed us to get to a spot where we started looking at recommending which schools we could close. So it was a long, drawn-out process. And so tonight, the idea is we're going to take you through what that looks like, starting with enrollment projections. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to start walking us through this map.
Thank you. So as Aaron said, we started out with identifying our need, and our need was we needed to right size. Because we at one point we had over 12,000 students, and we're still operating the same amount of square footage as we have with approximately 7,400 students. So it's not very efficient, and we're not making the best use of the space that we have. So the goal is to create efficiencies within our operations and finances, and then make recommendations. And we had two questions that were kind of overarching of all of that, and that was how many schools do we need, and where should they be, and then what facilities remain as is, and then what facilities need renovation, replacement, or consolidation. So then we had, as Aaron said, we had partners in our journey. We had Gray Architects, C.G. Schmidt, M.D. Rockers, among others. And then each of these, you can see that Gray Architects, we started that process with them in January of 2020. So this is something that's been going on for a couple of years now. It didn't just start. And the others that you can see like kind of the green highlighted there, that's a link to the long-range facilities master plan. So if you pull that up at home or on your phone, you can click on that link and it will take you to the report. Then C.G. Schmidt, their construction manager, they assisted with the long-range facilities master plan as well. And they did most of our MEP work, which is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. And again, the kind of greenish or teal, that's a link to that report. That report's about 600 pages long, and it goes into detail of all of those areas of every single site. And then the last, in March of 2020, we hired M.D. Rockers to do an enrollment projection study. So not only did they look at what they anticipated that enrollment would be for each of the schools in each of the grade levels, they did it out through 2035, but they also looked at housing, they looked at birth rates, they looked at all the different demographic information, not just what have we done historically with enrollment, but they looked at all those factors that are part of what make up enrollment. And then at the very bottom where it says studies and support materials, that'll take you to the district website that has all of the information related to the facilities master plan, the referendum, all the board reports, the FACT committee meetings, the presentations that were made. It'll have all of that information there. And this graph just shows, going back to 2014, on the far left-hand side, you can see where we were at in 2014 in terms of enrollment. And then on the very far right, that's in 2030, it's anticipated will be 7,060 students. So you can see that we took a sharp decline there for a while, and now it's kind of leveled out, and it'll level out. We'll still go down for a little bit, but it'll be pretty much leveled out. So that was another reason why we looked at, well, now is a good time to do this. We've taken the biggest hit in terms of drops in enrollment, and now it's going to level off, and it'll be smaller declines anticipated over the next 2 years. So that brought us to, if we're going to do something, what we need to do is not only look at enrollment, but we also need to look at our buildings. What shape are our buildings in? When were they built? When were all the mechanicals and everything? What is that all like? Because that plays a part into which schools are possibly going to be consolidated as well. And so, this is just kind of outlines what was all included in the long-range facilities master plan. And out of that came a short term, what we need to do, a medium term, and then long term, what we need to do. And one of the things, and I think it's on the next slide, this shows by school the capital improvement projects, or the CIP, that need to be done at every single school. And if you look at it, for all the 23 sites that we have, it's almost $248 million. And what that would be is that's not, that's just the mechanical, the electrical, the HVAC, the plumbing, the flooring, ceilings, things like that. It's not taking a classroom and reconfiguring it and updating it so that it's more ready for 21st century learning. This is mostly the things that people aren't going to see. Like I said, the roofing, the flooring, things like that. But it's all important to get done. And the other one, the $248 million, is that historically I get between $1.2 million and $1.5 million a year in the budget for capital improvement projects. So to put that $248 million in perspective, it's how many times would $1.5 million go into $248 million? Because if nothing changed, that's how long it would take us in our normal budgeting to be able to deal with all of those issues that we have. So that also led us to a Facilities Advisory Community Team, or FAC, and there were about 60 people that were on that board, or on that committee. It was district administration, it was faculty, it was community members, there were students, there were board members. We met over the course of about 6 months. I think all told it was a little over 400 hours that we met. And there were two overlying questions again, and that was, how can schools be renovated and/or replaced and/or consolidated in ways that inspire and shape learning for the future? And how can we do this in ways that are cost effective for our community? And then one of the tools we used to analyze all the different information that we were looking at, the architects and the construction management company came up with what they called long-range pathways. And so we would go through, we looked at, do we want to change the grade configurations? Do we want to have K-3 schools? Do we want to have 4 through 6 schools? We looked at, do we want to have K-8? So we looked at all those different things, and the way that we did that is we put them on these long-range pathways. And at one point, we had between 13 and 15 of these long-range pathways. By the time we got done analyzing all the information, looking at all the different options, and taking feedback from the members of the committee, came down to these two long-range pathways. And as it's hard to see on this, but if you look at the left-hand side and you see the little buildings there, there's no name on the building, it's just names, or just schools. But that means that we would have 8 elementary schools, is what FACT committee recommended. They felt that that would be the most efficient way for the district to operate elementary schools, would be to have 8 elementary schools. In the gray area below that, it shows 2 intermediate schools, and below that, on the bottom, it shows 3 high schools. And the only difference between these two pathways is the one on the left shows 3 high schools, the one on the right shows 2 high schools. It shows Hale and Central be combined into 1 comprehensive high school, and then we'd have 1 project-based learning high school. So one of the steps that the architects went through is they took all of our 17 sites, our school sites, and they looked at the considerations that are there, and then they said, okay, if we feel that this consideration at this site is in good shape, or it has this and it's in functioning in great order, then that's a plus. If it's kind of in between, it's not good, it's not bad, then it's blank and that's neutral. And then if there's something where it's deficient, then it got a minus. And so if you look at the bottom where you see that it goes, starting at the left, it goes red, green, yellow. With that, if you look at the first one, it has 2 minuses and a plus, so that means it's more minuses than plus, so it gets a negative. If there's more pluses than there are minuses, it's a green, and if it's the same number, it's yellow. And then what this does is this just takes all of those green, yellow, and reds for each of the schools, and it puts it on the district map. So it shows you where all of those schools are in relationship to the entire district, but also to each other. And then one of the last things that the FACT did is they made recommendations to the board. And there were 3 main ones, but the middle one is the one that's important, and that was reduce the number of school facilities across our district. And they recommended that we go to 8 elementary schools, 2 intermediate schools, 1 comprehensive high school, and 1 project-based learning high school. And so then, after that, we had a school consolidation committee, and that was a couple of board members and district administration. So we took all of the information that we've talked about so far, we looked at what the fact team did, we looked at what their recommendations were, and then we started diving into it a little more deeply. And our goal was to determine which schools would be consolidated based on the fact recommendations and the considerations. And then again, one was identify 1 intermediate school, and then what would the timing of that be? And then if the board was to approve that, what would the transition plan look like? And then identify 2 or 3 elementary schools, and again, what would the timing and the transition look like? So one of the recommendations that we had as well is that the municipalities that the district currently operates in, one of our goals is that we maintain a presence in those municipalities, that does not go away. So in this case, that means that we have to keep West Milwaukee Intermediate School because it's in West Milwaukee. So that means that we're left then with Frank Lloyd Wright and with Lane. And as you can see up there, it says West Milwaukee Intermediate School, the capital improvement projects total a little over $9 million. And what that comes out to is about almost $63 per square foot to make those improvements to that building. And so then between the 2 sites that were left, Frank Lloyd Wright and Lane, the architects identified Lane as the more challenging one for a couple of reasons. One is that it's landlocked. The age of the building, the original building is built in 1921. And then also the CIP needs of the building. So if you look at Frank Lloyd Wright and do the same analysis for that and for Lane as we did up on top, you can see that Frank Lloyd Wright is $110.56 per square foot, and Lane is $153 per square foot for those CIP costs. So then the recommendation was that we move forward with the consolidation of Lane Elementary School, and that would begin in the 23-24 school year. And then some of the questions that would have to be answered if the board approves that is that what is the transition plan? And then ultimately, what do we do with Lane? Do we sell it? Do we lease it? Do we repurpose it? And then the next step would be, after that, when we identify 2 or 3 elementary schools, and then the same questions there. When would we do that, and then, what would that look like?
So that's a ton of information, right? That leads us back to this roadmap. Essentially now, once we have some data and information that leads us to somewhat of a conclusion, right? You have to look at logistics, because it's not just all, how much it costs to a facility. You have to look at, where is the school boundaries are, or how does it impact elementary schools. There's a lot of other things that go into that, and that's kind of the analysis that I'm going to show you right now. And so we are on the roadmap here. Steve mentioned next steps. So the next steps are, well, how do you look at redesigning boundaries? With 3 intermediate schools, if you go to 2, how does that shift work? Where do the students go, and how do the boundaries get drawn? So that's what we're going to look at right now. But to do that, you have to have some priorities that align to how you make these decisions, right? So I'm going to talk through in order, not in no priority order, but the list of priorities we use, what priority order of high priority for us to make these boundaries, these ground boundaries fit. So as Steve mentioned, the goal was to redesign the intermediate boundaries to complement the potential closure of Lane, right? So priority 1 in order was to maintain solidarity among elementary students and intermediate school students. What that means is that no elementary school student should attend a different intermediate school as one of their peers at their current elementary. And a lot of people, I feel, that is something that they don't know. So a lot of our schools currently, with our current neighborhood boundaries, elementary school students actually get split to their intermediate school students, right? So we have schools where some students go to west and some go to right. We have some schools where some kids in elementary go to right and right, and some to Lane. And that is, if we can avoid that, I think we would all agree that's a good thing, right? So number 2, limiting the number of families who uprooted from any given school at any given time. And what I mean by that is literally the number of kids, right? And number 2, trying to limit the number of schools that any one student would shift, right? I have to shift from elementary and I have to be, or I have to move to this school to go to that school, right? So trying to keep some of the long-term pathways and context around who does this affect the most, and how often does it affect them, right? Affecting elementary school and middle school. Well, that's different than just affecting the ones, right? Continued geographic location, we have neighborhood schools. So to close a school and make a family drive across the district would not be a neighborhood, right? So trying to keep that in context, even though we know closing a school will literally mean you'll drive further, but it should be mitigated. You shouldn't be passing this, living the distance from home to school. Transportation costs, also how long a kid rides on the bus, right? We don't want that to become so egregious that students and families on the bus for hours. So one of the priorities, I have it down here in a minute, but is the transportation plans will be no longer than students currently run. And I think that is something that we had to look at hard, but it's something that we should be managing and making sure families and students don't have to ride the bus longer than any student does currently. Okay. Number 4, I kind of skipped 4 there, but each school's optimal enrollment versus max capacity. A good example is Central High School for the fire code have 2,100 kids. But that's not optimal. They only have 1,600 lockers. They only have 1 food room. They have, I think they have 2 art rooms. They have, a gym. They don't have enough bio labs to support that many students. So what's optimal, right? So I kind of have it here. The best indicator of how many students a school can have is how many they ever have, right? And so Steve talked about, we've come from a place where we had 10,000 students. So our schools have had a lot of kids in them. And so the best predictor of what they can have is what they have had. And so that's when I say optimal enrollment, that's what I mean tonight. And I'll show you kind of some historical analysis. We look at shifting schools. Well, how many kids can fit into the school? Well, how many have never had, right? And then lastly, the last 2, class sizes were made consistent per board policy. So we have set class sizes for elementary, which really gets down to 4th grade, 5th grade, all the way up to middle school, high school, and those numbers will not change. And then number 7, from a program perspective, logistically, consolidating schools does have some benefit for a lot of our programs. The first thing I'll mention is traveling teachers. We have a lot of traveling teachers in our district, and it's because our schools literally don't have enough students in them to justify having a full-time person, so they get split between 2 schools. That happens a lot with our elementary specialists. That happens a lot with our elective staff members, like shop, art, music, CTE, foods, a lot of those staff, and at a time, right, where you can all imagine that staffing is harder than ever, it's very difficult to find people that can get a job anywhere to do that job and travel home. So there's some program, some logistic issues that would solve. And then part B there, increasing class offerings. Oftentimes at our high school, predominantly, but across the whole district, but mostly there, we'll have like 6 kids sign up for AP Stats, or it's probably a bad example of AP Calculus. And so that's a Halo or Central. And then at the other school, you'll have 6 or 7 kids as well. And so it gets difficult to run a class of 6 students for 1 full-time teacher. But as a district, we want to often that class that you've worked your entire career to get to. And so what ends up happening is we have to have students go first hour for that class, miss their second hour, and come back. We have to schedule the second hour, so they miss advisory. So it's some of the logistics consolidation does work to review. Okay, some assumptions. Creating a system without assumptions is impossible. So some assumptions are Lane would consolidate, potentially Longfellow, potential merger with high school. We use enrollment projections, cast forward to 25-26. I mentioned optimal enrollments for the backwards design. Since students feed from our elementary up, it's easiest to start with the top and work back, right? The least number of schools to the biggest number of schools. And so we start with high school, since we are talking at this time about, we're not literally able to consolidate high school. There's too many kids at this point at that high school level to fit in one high school. So looking at intermediate, we'll look at the draft boundaries. So let's do that quick. So this is something that you'll be able to see on the screen here, but if you have your phone open, it's easier to see. You can zoom in. So, okay, so this is our intermediate map as it currently sits, okay? So in blue here you have Lane intermediate, and in white you can see here our number. That is the projected enrollment of Lane next year, 457 students. In yellow, the most central intermediate school is Franklin Wright, with a projected enrollment at 744, and then West Milwaukee are on the far right here, on the east side, is 316 students. So that is currently our intermediate layout. right? So the question becomes, as you look at our current boundaries, where would you, if hypothetically, if you were going to consolidate, where would the boundary be? Right, you have 2 now, not 3. And so,
Down here, we'll look at that.
so this draft map kind of shows you So this is our intermediate, our elementary map. Essentially, now we're looking at, if you were going to draw the boundary, how could you draw a boundary that would complement geographic location, optimal enrollments, students' distance to school, solidarity among elementary and intermediate school students. So you really have to keep it in context a lot of where does this affect the elementary students. That's why this map shows you this this black line. I believe, I get this mixed up, I believe that is 76th Street. And that is the divider currently, kind of where our elementary boundaries are for Horace Mann and Jefferson Elementary here, okay? And so, a couple things. So, if you look at how many students, optimally at the bottom here, optimal enrollments, how many students would this mean for Franklin, Wright, West Milwaukee? At the bottom, if Walker, Madison, Wilson, Franklin, Irving, Hoover, and Mitchell all fed into Franklin Wright, that would be in 25, 26, 860 students. Similarly, for West Milwaukee, it would be 537 here. And one of the points I want to make is for the boundary right here, for the Jefferson families to go to Franklin Wright, the distance for them to go to Franklin Wright versus West Milwaukee is within blocks. So initially when I looked at that, I thought, wow, I feel like the Jefferson families that are the furthest west might live extremely close to Franklin Wright in comparison to West Milwaukee, but that isn't the case. Like if 2 people were at Jefferson and both walked opposite directions to go to middle school, they would get to those schools at similar times. Because it's that regionally, or I guess in proximity that much, it's that comparable. So that's kind of the draft map of how it would affect elementary students. Okay, so this is kind of what I talked about earlier, but how do our current elementary students, how do they go to middle school? Where do they go, right? On the left side of the screen here, this shows you currently which elementary students go to which intermediate school. And the percentages do change a bit, right? Because every year, as students exit to go to 6th grade, the percentages are based on current enrollment, so it's where you live dictates where you go. If you live in this neighborhood, and you go to that middle school, but then if the next year you go to 6th grade, then 80% might become 79, things like that change. But generally, all of Pershing goes to West Milwaukee, half of Longfellow goes to West Milwaukee, 80% of Mann goes to West Milwaukee. And you can see as we shift from currently to the draft plan, all of Pershing would go, half of Longfellow would go, but then as we shift over, well, this should say half of Longfellow. So all of Longfellow would end up going to West Milwaukee together, all of Horace Mann and all of Jefferson. And then Franklin Wright, essentially the only difference for Franklin Wright would be all of Jefferson would end up with West Milwaukee and the other half of Longfellow. And what that would do is it would absorb, Franklin Wright would have all of the Lane families currently, that all the elementary students that are pathway to Lane would go to Franklin Wright. So that's kind of how the map changes for elementary students. So kind of some of the priorities just reiterated here. So what does this do? It allows families to attend the closest intermediate schools to them in proximity, with the potential consolidation of Lane. It would affect the least number of families in terms of new intermediate pathway. It would affect the Jefferson community because they were planning to go to Wright when they go to West Milwaukee. Similarly, the half of Longfellow would be planning to go to Franklin Wright and now be going to West Milwaukee. Transportation costs, currently all of Lane students are offered bus because it's a designated passing area, so we plan for that. And so that plan would still happen here with students going from Lane to Franklin Wright. But there would be additional costs there with our intermediate or elementary students being transported down, right? In that plan. So about 125,000 to 175. It's a range because It's unknown until we have the sheriff's department conduct an audit, and they'll tell us where, if you need a crossing guard here, that's something we would know, they can tell us that, so that costs. This is built in for 2 to 3 buses, each bus is about $50,000, so $100,000, $150,000 busing, with an additional expense depending on the crossing guards or, and then it configures drop the roll into 10%. So, estimated cost in terms of savings and consolidation, it's just under $950,000 annually in terms of consolidation, number of families it affects. I talked about transportation, and then lastly, as Steve mentioned, this is kind of the CFP costs associated with consolidation. So that is Lane. I guess that's it, so.
You good? We got 30 minutes? Awesome. So that is a lot of information to kind of take in. I hope what experience through the presentation is just how much work and analysis and how much time has been committed to this effort to get us to this point. This has been more than 2 years in the making at this time, and it included, the first effort coming out of the facility master plan. The board decided to start with the high school question, and that referendum did not pass. You all know that. But it doesn't mean the rest of the plan goes away, right? So the rest of this facility master plan that's been developed is still kind of in the works. And so we're in the process now of getting ready to bring recommendations to the board. And the plan is that the board will have those in front of it at a special meeting on June 6th. So that's kind of where we are. And so now we're ready to respond to questions. So what are you curious about related to this? We also have Dee Raymer here, Director of Leadership and Learning. So if there's questions on the learning side of how all of these transitions may happen, she's available as well. Who wants to start us off?
I'll start.
Sure, thank you.
What are you guys looking at as far as cost for a vacant building sitting? Because the reality is, it sounds like there's not a plan necessarily for what each building is going to be doing, whether it's sold, kept, or what would be an average cost? Because even with a vacant building, there's still a cost associated with that. And is that included in that savings amount, or how does that work?
So there are carrying costs, right? When you
Yeah.
have to maintain, at least 55 degrees during the winter or something. I assume something like that. You still have to shovel and mow the lawn because you can use the sidewalks and those kind of things. But I don't know what your best estimate is of what that would be.
Yeah, what I did is I went back and I looked at all the costs, like utility costs and all of that for the last full school year. And given what we've been through the last couple of years, that ended up being the 2018-19 school year. Once we get through June 30th, we'll have this year we could use, but that was the last full year. And so we looked at that, and then what I estimated that, because there's water, there's electricity, there's gas, there's all of the sewer and all of that. So what I did is I looked at what the cost was to operate each of the schools, and then I estimated that if they were closed, we would have a savings of 70% of what those utility costs would be. And I didn't look at it individually as water, sewer, and all that. I just put all the utilities together, said this is the amount, and then at every one it said there would be a 70% savings.
Just out of curiosity, did you guys look at when there was COVID and the kids weren't in the school, that duration of time when nobody was here, like that would be a good indicator? Like, hey, this was our water at around like this time, nobody was here. So like, is that something that you guys kind of looked at?
Yeah, that's how I ended up with the 70%.
Okay, okay. No, that makes sense.
And there again, I mean, that changes a little bit year to year based on the weather and all of that, but that was a good, looking at all of it, that was a good spot to land on.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to play the devil's advocate.
Okay.
Since high school are for class, what happens if we guys close this for elementary and middle schools closing? Those events, then what happens to the schools that need all of them?
So this does not include another referendum question, right? It just now is a question before the school board. And so if the school board does not pass this, what it would mean, we would continue to operate all of our school buildings, and we would have to start making some recommendations about dramatically changing where we put money in what. Right? And so this is not about, we can afford to run all the schools we currently have, but then we can't afford to continue to improve teacher compensation. Right? We're really proud this year and next year we made a commitment to improving teacher compensation. We're one of the lowest average teacher salaries in this area, right? So we have a hard time competing to keep teachers. So if we keep all of the buildings, we can't keep investing in everything else that are priorities for us, right? So that's the balancing act in the budget. We've resolved our financial challenges, right? So the challenges of 6-7 years ago now are well addressed, right? We are sound, stable, good credit rating, that we're in really good shape. But this is about being efficient with the dollars we have and making sure we invest in the priorities that are closest to kids, which are the teachers, right? So this is now really a question before the board. Will there be another referendum someday? That's a little bit of hypothetical, but probably the old buildings are still going to be old. They're not getting expensive, right? So we're going to have to probably go back to the community at some point and say we're going to have support to keep the aging buildings running. There's just not room in the budgets, the way they're designed in the state of Wisconsin, to allow us to do everything. Sure.
How much money would the district be losing without operating plan? Because 21 years ago, you had just West Milwaukee and Franklin, right? And then you bought Heritage and turned it into Lane. So how, would you guys just then again sell this building? Or like you were talking about with Madison, repurposing some of the buildings? How much money would that be lost from purchasing this building?
So there are savings by not running the building, right? But in terms of, there wouldn't be a loss, except for if we carry it and it's empty for a couple of years. So that's, some dollars we have to invest. So it's about 30% of the current operating costs. In terms of what we would do with it, Lane, I think is interesting. Where it sits right here on Highway 100, it may be of interest for commercial development, right? That's a possibility. It may be something that we've actually had conversations with Shelley Strasser, Recreation and Community Services. Does this become a potential because it has, a brand new section, right? So the idea potentially would be they take over the building, keep the brand new section, the rest of this gets torn down and there's a field, right? So there's another recreation center like there's on the east side. That's an interesting idea. That's a little bit ahead of where we are. The board has to make some decisions first. We have to get through this part of it. We're not going to be able to sell it, repurpose it, or turn it into a commercial development if there's kids here.
Well, I guess my second question onto that would be, why was Lane bought in the first place?
Okay.
Because, seems like to have West Milwaukee and Franklin right. So why was they bought?
So this one gets a little bit complicated. So it's a little bit before I joined. But if you think back to the enrollment graph, right, and so we were at 9,000+, and it came down pretty sharply. And that was not only that there's just general enrollment decline, you know, the one on your left, but there's just generally fewer kids being born nowadays, but that dramatic enrollment decline is also related to the board wanting to manage open enrollment differently. And so open enrollment is a program in the state that allows parents to choose to enroll their kids in any district in the state. Most of them go to neighboring districts, right? So if you want to go to a neighboring district, you can through open enrollment. And so the practice here had been any parent that wants to choose West Allis, West Milwaukee can come. And what that would do, and this is part of what led to the financial challenges, and what that would do is, like, just keep taking kids, it would mean that all of a sudden we'd have classrooms that are full, and there's 5 more 4th graders that show up. So now we're hiring another 4th grade teacher for 5 kids. Well, those 5 kids don't pay for that teacher, right? So what we're doing now is managing it in a way that actually fills available seats in classrooms where we already have a teacher that paid for in the budget, right? So by managing it differently, that actually brought down the enrollment quite a bit. So when we were at 9,000, we needed the 300 schools. But by managing open enrollment so that it's really cost effective for us, we're at a point now with just general declining enrollment and managing open enrollment differently, we no longer need money. We go get different people in.
So if we keep all of the schools, because they're all able to be supported and maintained at whatever capacity, what does that mean for enrollment? So that means that most of the buildings are going to be under enrolled, and then are we then opening more
So, it's possible, yes, that would be a strategy. I don't know that we would recommend that to the board. It's one of the things that we use as kind of a mantra in managing budgets is, in a budget, you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything, right? Same as true in our home, right? You can decide, I can decide to do anything I want, but that means I can't do something else. And so that same reality, right? So we decide to keep all the buildings and they're low enrollments, they're more costly to run. So we're gonna have to do other things, or we have to bring more kids back in. And the goal with open enrollment is we try to keep open enrollment to about 10% of each building. We kind of like that balance, it creates a little more diversity. We're proud of the fact that lots of families can walk who want to come to school here. But we want to maintain neighborhood schools as well that are ours. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, I think you hit on all of
Okay.
it. I think when we consolidation in turn, based on our calculations, would have buildings running more efficiently. So the way I think about it is, if you have a school that needs 11 and a half teachers, it isn't always possible to have every teacher travel to every 12. And then that's the half that you fill open seats. So the 8 or 9 kids in the building, like a class of 20, is how you can allocate them per seat per year. So that's kind of how we currently do it. And so if we did fill the school, you might need 11 and a half or 15 or 16, which might be a third or a fourth of the school would have to be open enrolled to make that happen.
Yep. Yeah, come down here, I'm just trying to get different voices.
So with the two middle schools, there's like a 323 student differential between what would be at Moline and what would be at West Milwaukee. Does that make sense really? When you're looking at that many more students per middle school, how much space is being left out of West Milwaukee that can be used for those students versus making larger class sizes at one school and smaller class sizes at another? That's a huge difference in student.
So currently, that's how it's done. Regular has 850 students this year, West is 300. It's actually a bigger. But to your point, West's optimal enrollment is like for the building to run, where it would be, it would be the classes aren't, not super full, 20-corner room. They can easily fit over 550 students in that building. And Franklin Wright used to run with 1,200. So Franklin Wright, with that many students, it's a very large school. Having under 900 kids would be very, I guess, optimally.
I was just thinking balancing it out with just buildings and students, so it's not such.
So the challenge of that, West isn't big enough to move another 100 kids over, unless we went to referendum for the leadership, right? So 550 is about the right size, right on enrollment for West. You're not, if you put another 100 kids in there, it'll be overcrowded. That's the challenge with that building.
And then some of the problems domino into elementary students. So if we did something like that, then we'd be cutting into half of Franklin goes to West, and half of Franklin stays at right. But then half of Franklin that goes to West is going to say, but I live like down the street. It's like it creates other issues. So, but to your point, yeah.
There's no way of getting around all the issues.
Right.
What are you guys looking at as an average class size for like middle school and elementary school after, like, if these, these changes happen, like, what would be the average class size roughly? You may not have the exact number, but I think maybe.
Yeah, so our elementaries, we aim to have a building average. So that would be the same. Now, each class, the principals have the authority to move and have sometimes principals go, I want a second and third grade teacher. So it's like ranges, but generally we don't expect the building to have more than 22. And really, in the fifth grade, we don't expect the buildings to have over 25. So it's like that's kind of the approach. And with secondary, it's we look at 27 classrooms. Optimally, we look at 25 for a building for creating maps like this to make sure there's more than enough room. That's what we've been doing for staffing.
Yeah, just that keeps coming up. The goal is not to change classrooms, it's just to be more efficient with the space that we have. So all of the teachers right now that we have currently employed for the should not have 2 whole classes crammed in a space. And I taught at West Milwaukee when we just had some playwriting in West Milwaukee, and at that time, that was when we were about 1,200 and about 600, which is why Lincoln became an intermediate school next. And then all things sort of happened to where we are now. And one of the challenges with just keeping that level of students with us under open enrollment is it led to some inequities within our schools where there would be a whole class of ninth graders, and more than half the students are with us under open enrollment. And we feel very strong, we believe in our open enrollment program. But the culture of that community, when the kids were coming into us at ninth grade, really hard to maintain the culture of what had been built K-8 with all of those students, when half of that class may end up being students who are coming to us from all over the place. It just created some dynamics in our schools. It just became pretty challenging to manage.
What is the amount that you guys are looking at moving forward to allocate towards the building maintenance each year, so that we're not kind of in the same position of like, we have all these buildings, there's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done on them. My assumption is the reason that there's so much maintenance not done on them is because it hasn't been done over the course of years, right? Like, it's not just all of a sudden, a bunch of buildings need maintenance. It's been over the course of years, so is there gonna be a specific amount? I know you had mentioned like 1.5, or somebody had mentioned 1.5 was originally the amount. I mean, is there, and clearly that amount, I'm assuming, did not go to the building maintenance, because if it did, I'm assuming that we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. So that's why I'm like, what's gonna be allocated, and how are we gonna make sure that it is allocated to make sure that we're not in the same position with the buildings?
Yeah, and that's a, you know, I understand what the question you're asking, but it's a difficult one to answer. The analogy that I use with the board sometimes is like, I mean, first I'll back up. The average age of our buildings is over 76 years old. And some of them were built, like the original part of this building was built in 1921. So the analogy I use sometimes in presentations to the board is it's like when you have a brand new vehicle, you have to do some maintenance to it, but it's not very much, it's not very often, it doesn't cost a lot. Once that vehicle gets 150,000 miles on it, it's 12 years old, you've got to do more maintenance. Some of it comes along, it's unexpected. It's not planned for as much as you try to keep up on things. It just happens. Part of what we're running into now, because the buildings are so old, is that actually if you look at the reports that the architects and C.G. Schmidt did, they said that the buildings are really in remarkably good shape given the age. Part of the problem that we're running into is that they're older, so the repairs cost more. The other is that some of the systems that we have are from, you know, when they were originally built, so we can't find parts anymore. So if a system breaks, like for example, some of our fire suppression system or fire alarm system, they all function, they all work, everybody's safe, but if a circuit happens to go bad, that we have to change the whole system up because we can't find those parts anymore. So number one, that costs more than if we, you know, there isn't, we do maintenance on the systems, but they only can last for so long and then they just wear out. Another good example is a couple of years ago we needed to replace some of the mechanism underneath the bleachers at Central. Nobody made those parts anymore, so we had to hire a company that had to hand manufacture all of the parts that went to it. So number one, it took longer. Number two, is a lot more expensive than if we could just go somewhere and buy stock parts.
So the other piece I want to add to what Steve shared is, right now our buildings are being maintained, they're safe, but they're aging, right? But what we've been doing the past few years is, what Steve has in the budget for capital improvement has been $1.2 million. It was built in the budget for the coming year is 1.5, and this is going to have to slowly creep up. And when the referendum did not pass, I turned to Caitlin, so Aaron's predecessor, and I said, that budget line needs to go $5 million, right? We're going to have to find dollars. That means other things in the budget we won't do, right? So again, it's like figure out in the budget because there's only a maximum amount of money in the state funding formula that we're allowed to bring in as a school district. But over time, I really think that the community does support the referendum to help with the old buildings. That's going to impact class sizes probably, it's going to impact programming probably, but it is a line that probably has to go to $5 million a year so that we can make a dent in this.
And one of the things we do too, we try to plan as much as we can. So for example, like with roofing, I have a 20-year plan for roofing. And so I know that next year we plan on doing this section of, of a building. We might have 5 buildings in there. We try to level out the cost based on how, what section's going to need to be replaced and the cost. So we have plans like that in place as well, where we try to, not just saying, well, this one has a leak, so we need to replace it. We try to plan it out based on when was the last time that it was done, what shape is it in. So we do infrared scans, all of that. So we do a lot of that behind the scenes as well, so that we can try and plan out what needs to be done when, and then that way we try to mitigate the surprises that we have as well.
Overall, cost-wise, is less to make whatever changes are needed than frankly, right, but is it just more because the square footage for what you want done, not necessarily the whole building square footage?
Yeah, if you look at the cost per square foot, it's really the piece to pay attention to, because that creates an apples to apples comparison. So the cost per square foot for FLW is actually less than Link.
So with Lynn, I know recently you guys, within the last few years, redid kind of the other side of Lynn. Was that counted in the square footage for what needs to be done?
Yeah.
I just have a little bit different question, and this is more like how I'm going through construction. Now, I don't have middle school students, so I don't really know exactly, but from what I've heard about Link, they have like the bowl side and the traditional side. Does Franklin Wright do that? Is that going to be something that's still offered?
Yes, they do, and yes, it does. So we have 4 communities this year, and we're going to give their size next year, they'll reduce down to 2 learning communities. They've been doing that even a little bit longer than the communities that are currently operating at Lane. So they're really well managed, they're very inclusive for all students, and they do a really nice job of that. West also has 2 of those same types of learning communities. The teams are just much smaller at West, and we just have 2-person teams there, whereas at Fairfield there are 4 teacher teams.
And so there's 2 of the 4 teacher teams, and then the rest is more traditional and middle school.
And one of the commitments we've made to teachers as we continue to, if the board does choose to do this and then vote to do this and then we move, is to keep those teaching teams together. So one of the first communities that started at Franklin Drive came from when we closed Lincoln. And a teacher team that was doing much that work like together, and then added 2 more teachers and that group to that community. Assuming that they want to stay together, the hope would be to move the local community, all the teachers together as units, they can keep doing what they're doing here, just in a physically new space.
So do you guys are plan to ensure that both of our middle schools are aligned so that the kids are all funneled into the same?
Yep, so we had this, we had a 6th grade community for the first time ever at West this year, that's going to grow into 6-7 and grow into 7-8. Their challenge really does become at 316 students, they cannot do the same kind of flexibility that some of our other schools can do when we have that many staff, because so many of the staff, some of the things that happen here at Lane and Lane Global, as well as at Franklin Wright, is the art teacher can push into the space and do projects with the kids. We cannot do that at West because those communities, right, the art teacher's only there for 2 hours, because that's how many kids we have, and then they go travel with someone else. So this actually allows us more of those opportunities and an easier way to staff some of those challenging ones. Yeah, but there'll be a ton of joint training between the staff at Lane, Franklin Wright, and West. Again, assuming that the board does go ahead with the vote on June 6th. Then we're planning out professional development for next year, where the teachers are all doing that together so that they can start to know each other and get used to each other. And that transition becomes a little bit more seamless throughout the process of that, as well as some opportunities for students to start doing activities together between the locations so that we get some familiarity going, so that they start to know teachers. Middle school is a really tough age, right? For those of you who have middle schoolers, it's a challenging age for kids. They're trying to figure out who they are and all of those good things. And so we want to get as much familiarity with staff and kids as possible, if that is what we need to do next.
What does that mean for my incoming sixth grader? I have an eighth grader that's leaving and a sixth grader that's coming into Lynn. So what would that mean for her if this was changed, like say her seventh grade year?
Yeah.
So, sixth grade will be sixth grade at Lane, but with a lot of the kind of planned experiences that help them lead into the transition to FLW. So we've only brainstormed through this point, because until we know the board has set some direction, I don't want to use too much staff time putting details to it. But the brainstorm ideas are to make sure students in both directions, so that the seventh grade, new combined seventh grade class, so those sixth graders from FLW have time over here at Lane, Lane students have time over there, they have time together. We've imagined they do a joint dance, right? Right, so even those kind of things, how do you facilitate the kind of student experience that when they land in seventh grade together, they already have friends that are from the other school, they know kind of where the layout of the new school, all of those kind of things we can facilitate. And that's kind of where we are now thinking, but very much kind of thoughtful about making sure the student experience is one that, okay, I know I'm going to go there, that's going to be my new school, that's exciting, that's what we want to create for kids. Sure.
More about transition plans, because honestly, living in the neighborhood where we have so many kids that are walking to Lane, and I think it kind of sucks for those of us that live right here, because the families that walk. It's in this neighborhood because of walking, because of Lane, and now no, wait, never mind. The kids are going on the bus, so there's transition all the way from school on. And my daughter's in sixth grade, and this is the first time she's absolutely walked to school. Is this year. Now we thought, oh wait, never mind. Your eighth grade year, you're gonna get on the bus. I know in the past, when we transitioned into this middle school, it was sixth grade 1 year, then 6, 7, 6, 7, 8. What about our eighth graders? Is there anything in line that they could have their last year here? Just like they have transitioned into it. Because there's been so many changes for them. They didn't really have a normal fifth grade end of the year celebration, and all that fun stuff that they got to do with families and classmates, and now kind of sitting there, oh, eighth grade, well, that's fun, I don't know, too, so change, and then, oh, wait, high school, you may or may not have consolidated high school, you may or may not have to change schools 2 years into high school, so there's a lot going on there. I think there needs to be a solid transition plan before any decisions are made, and I kind of say that as a parent, and as a teacher, not in the system, but, you know, if it's brought to the board, I would hope that they, if they don't have enough information on that, that they would say, wait, we need a little bit more time. I think it would help parents and families to know what they're doing.
Yep, so I appreciate the question. Like I said in my introduction, they're extraordinarily difficult questions, you know, to have to face and put forward to a board. There's no easy solution to any of this, and there is no way to do a school consolidation without impacting kids and families, right? It's just, there's no way to do it. And I'm fine if I try to sugarcoat this in any other way. But the reality is, right, if we're going to be more efficient and have dollars to put into old buildings and dollars to pay teachers better, we have to make some hard decision that it comes with impact. We're going to do the best we can to make sure that the student experience is honored and for the transition kids, it's probably interesting and fun. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard on you. It's going to be hard on your kid. It's going to be hard on the teachers. That, you know, the teachers here are close knit and they love this place too. They're getting uprooted. But there aren't better answers than facing the question of consolidation is probably the right thing to do. And we're not the only place that's facing this right now. Cudahy closed an elementary school this year, for September. Well, Waukesha did the same thing. And right now in La Crosse, they're way down the road of consolidating their high schools. And so we're among friends facing the realities of, you know, declining enrollment, but we won't be the last either, that's for sure.
I think though to her point, and I respect what you're saying, and I think what she said was a really good point in the sense of even if it was looked at as like the sixth grade class now, like there are more classes coming in the lane, right? And maybe it's broken down to only half the building is used for their eighth grade. I think that when you're talking about an amount of savings that would be done, yeah, of course the building savings is important, that's why we're here, right? Is to talk about the money aspect of things, and that's what the whole conversation has been about. I think her conversation is more about what is best for the students. And again, that decision of combining and things like that for the district as a whole is very, very important for kids, for the district. At the same token, though, if you were to look at that one class of sixth grade kids that did have COVID and all those things, didn't have the fifth grade graduation, I don't know how much would it really affect 1 year for them, just the eighth graders to do eighth grade at Lincoln, right? Like, is that something that the board would take into consideration, or the school district, just for the sake of like, you know what, we are doing this, we're also looking at the students aside from the building. And again, everything you guys are doing here, I believe you're doing it wholehearted of, here's what we think is best for the district, here's what we think is best for the students. For something like that for one school, I don't know if that would be too much to ask. Do you know what I mean, for their last year? Because that is a lot of transition for kids, and they're going to be going into a new high school, and that's a lot for kids, you know?
And we have talked about, so what you're describing, the words we use is a phase out, phase down model, so that you stop sixth grade coming in and then you kind of let the kids percolate out. It becomes very difficult to staff, and so it creates its own set of problems, even though it feels like it might be better for kids. In the end, the last class doesn't have a really cool middle school experience. It's only in eighth grade now. There's not much school left anymore. So it's a trade-off, right? Which kind of direction you want to honor in terms of the student experience, but it is part of the conversation, and maybe it comes up at the board meeting. You know, we can certainly entertain that kind of direction, but in the end, I don't think that's a great experience for the last class being the only kind of group that's in the building. Sure.
Well, just as a parent, for the other perspective, as a parent who does have two sixth graders here who have been through the same experiences, for us, I think it would be better for them to pick up and move with their entire class over to the other school, especially if you're keeping global with global and traditional with traditional, they're going to be going with those same kids, so the building doesn't matter. If the teachers are moving, to my kids and us, moving doesn't matter as much as the community. And if they're moving with that community, from my perspective, it doesn't matter. And I would rather have that than they finish out their last year here as them, because we did see when they opened, it was just a sixth grade class. And then just a sixth and seventh grade class, and that was hard on those kids too. So, I mean, there's no great answers, but if you're moving them as a community as a whole, it may not be so bad.
I mean, not about communities, the community is going to change for them, as it is for the kids that are middle schools also. And I honestly don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to bring in a sixth grade class, only to have them the next year have another teacher, and start in sixth grade. So she's going to start sixth grade here, and then, well, wait a minute, that's too much. I think there needs to be, there should be a better
Let me give you an example. We went through this experience with Lincoln, right, when it was a intermediate school with us. So that was part of the financial crisis we were in, and just we had to shut it down, and all the students moved to FLW. And we didn't do as thoughtful as a transition that I'm describing because we didn't have the time. But visiting FLW that September, I could figure out pretty quickly like which are Lincoln kids, which are FLW kids. By the middle of October, I couldn't tell the difference. It was one school, right? It took 6 weeks for the kids to be like, oh, this is where we are. They're middle school kids. They're adaptable. It's not easy on them, but they are adaptable. Sorry, I had a question. Okay.
I had a comment. My daughter's a walker, okay? And one of the things that she asked me coming into sixth grade is how come I can't go to FLW with the majority of the other students who are in her fifth grade class? I think that the issue, I guess, for Lane comes that almost all of Walker comes to Lane. So all those kids are then moving to Frank Lloyd Wright, but they all live in the same neighborhood. So I guess what she's saying, I mean, when you have that and you have like an entire community from Walker coming to one middle school, you know, versus Wilson who's split up, you know, into two middle schools, it's not going to phase them as much as it would phase kids at Walker. I guess does that kind of?
Yeah, so I do expect, I think I understand. I do expect that the board will have a conversation and want information about what if we either like move all of sixth grade right to FLW for next year, right? So we don't like have them here for a year and then they move, or do we give parents an option, right? So if you want to have your kids start in their, you know, in FLW. The challenge of it is that where we are in terms of we're, you know, leading into the end of this school year, at the end of May. At the end of May, we are completely locked in for next year for class choices, for staffing, for budgets. If we weren't, you should really be worried about me as a superintendent because we have to be done with planning for next year before the school year ends. So to change that is pretty hard and complicated. And Aaron's done some of the initial kind of exercises of what if, so we simply like, you know, whiteboarded what if we gave the option and split 50-50. Well, now we have to double staff in sixth grade because half the sixth graders are FLW. So now we have to hire twice as many teachers, right? So you see how it starts to kind of fall out in terms of the dominoes with it. But I do expect the board to explore that and want to know a little bit more about the cost, and we'll see where the board goes. Yes.
So what they're asking, isn't there going to be the same thing for the high school? Because they're going to have one class finishing, one high school classes are going to come in. And that was okay. Am I correct?
Yes. That was
So,
it.
doing one, you know, exception for the class that finish off their time at Hill, and everybody else will go to Central.
So that was the initial plan with the high school, was to allow kind of a phase in, phase out, and there would eventually be a last 12th grade at Central High School. As we worked through that, there was a lot of parent input and feedback, so that was probably not the best solution, because we were going to move everybody over to Central with construction, and then move everybody back, and let the last class of Central. In the end, the better solution was keep Hale kids that are neighborhood boundary at Hale through construction, and as soon as construction is ready, all of them will get picked up. Right, so it wouldn't be kind of this phase out last class. So in the end, it was similar to what we're describing here. That the point at which you have to decide. Yes.
What is the last year that this school will be functioning?
So if the board approves the plan, the last year would be next school. So the 23-24 school.
One more year.
One more year. Yep. Yes.
I was just looking at the map, the changes in the middle schools, like the elementary schools feeding into the middle school. So you guys still have Walker or Madison and Longfellow are on there, obviously because they're still in operation, but we know that might not last for very long. Has that, like, are those kids going to be fed into the school that can still go to West Milwaukee, or will still go, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So that's the future?
Right, so the plan is that if the board approves this, right, all of Madison will go to Walker. That makes sense. We'll keep the whole community together. It doesn't work as nicely at Longfellow. Longfellow would go to Pershing and Jefferson. Right, so, but all of Jefferson in the new intermediate school now would go to West. Right, so all of the current Longfellow kids would still be going together at West.
That it gets complicated if the board does consider a third elementary in this time, because Wilson does not have that same, although it is one of our most expensive schools by square footage to renovate, should we get down that road and need to do some of that work as we project down further, that becomes very, very complicated, which is what we've been trying to figure out, right? We're trying to follow the recommendations of the fact committee, but at the same time, do that in a way that's as feasible as possible, knowing that none of this is done.
Yes.
Is what they're saying the way it is? I mean, you're eating another school that didn't have
the community that we have, we would have combined coordinate like for a second, third split. Is that gonna stay or is that gonna change?
Yeah, that will stay. It was, Walker had at one point 375, 76 students.
So Madison's gonna adopt Walker.
They function, Madison stays a little bit more straight grade than Walker right now, but instructionally, we've been working on the same training for the last several years. So instructional format, the way they provide instruction, the way they deliver instruction is very, very simple. The setup of class size and the way they don't do as much co-teaching as we do at Walker right now. So that'll be new learning for some of the teachers at Madison, but they've got all of this in professional development and training, kind of with intention. That's where some of these logical decisions about combining do make some sense if the teachers have the same amount of training, the same kind of training, the same type of instructional practices happening. The transition to merge those two schools just becomes a lot easier.
Everything gets closed the way that you guys are proposing right now. Are you guys thinking of back the number of units that might decide on how this new plan is and leaving the district? How would that affect all the numbers? If you're combining, I don't know how many elementary schools it would be going to all feed into for those right versus being everywhere else.
So that question has come up in each of these sessions, so I appreciate that, and we understand that that is a risk. When we make these kinds of changes, I think the example of, we bought a house in this neighborhood, and we understand that parents have choices. So there are parochial schools in our community, and we want those to be good schools too. But we respect that if the parent chooses that, and I've had this conversation many times over the years with a parent that says, well, then I'm going to take my kid and I'm going to go somewhere else. Well, then I trust you as the parent to make that decision. It's your job to make the best decision for your kid. And if that means I don't like that we move our schools, but I have to trust you to respect your decision as a parent. And so if we lose some kids because of this, I trust parents have made a decision that's better for their particular kid.
I think the irony of that is that I don't know if people really know that a lot of our neighborhood districts also don't have open enrollment available. So even if you are trying to leave the district and trying to go to one of our neighborhood districts, there's no seats. So unless you're looking at private broken schools within the city.
It's a good point. Not every district welcomes children from other municipalities.
I have one last question. So, and is this recorded?
Yes.
Like the questions are?
Yes.
Okay, and the reason I'm asking, I'll explain why after I ask my question, why I asked this question. For each meeting that you guys have had, I've been to a couple of them, I've done the online, how many people would you say on average are at the meeting?
I think the first one, not counting board members and district staff, I think at the first one, there's somewhere between 25 and 30. I think there's 16 at this one, and at the one last week, I think it was right around 20 again.
At Longfellow, there's 6 community members.
So I just wanted those numbers to be out there since this is something recorded. I find it frankly pathetic that I see a lot of Facebook, social media, walking and complaining and bashing, and regardless whether they agree with it or don't agree with it, I find it very pathetic that that is the average number of people who come to these meetings to educate themselves on here's what's going on. And that's why I asked it to be recorded, because I want people to hear that it's purely pathetic that here we are, we have you guys taking so much time to educate the district, to let us know the information. Here's why we have to make these decisions. And people are just like, some people are so outraged, and some people are cheering. Yet at the end of the day, I just find it hard to believe that so many people are really taking the time to educate themselves on what's going on and why. And so that's why I was going to ask that question.
Thank you for putting that out there.
People can hear.
To add to that, I tried getting into one of the meetings, and I tried for almost 40 minutes of the meeting, and I was like, screw it, I'll watch it after the fact because you couldn't even get onto the live feed.
Yeah, we had a.
Yeah, there's like a password that you fix it.
No, it was the first one with young elementary school, and you could not get on, it just kept spinning and spinning. And you can't really hear it recorded. I can't really hear it. Like I was trying to listen to this one before I could.
Yeah, okay. No, I appreciate Yes.
So you have all these meetings for the community to hear all the different presentations. It's going to be presented to the board. What the board decides, is that the final, or will it then be, this is what the board has decided, community, do you agree with it or not?
So the board is elected by the community, right? So they're your representatives, but making decisions about the work of the school district, the big decisions, the policy decisions. So the board's decision is final.
And that would be after the next board.
Correct. There's a special board meeting on June 6th.
And then decide at that time.
Yes. Well, I don't speak for the board. They could say, well, we need more information, so we'll come back with this, a week from now. And that's, their prerogative. But we anticipate that we'll have a recommendation that they take action. It's part of our urgency about the decision as the longer it gets delayed, the less opportunity we have to put a good transition plan in place. So we're a little anxious about getting a decision made so we know what to do next.
So if we have strong opinions one way or another, we can direct those, that feedback questions to the board.
Right.
And there'll be public comment that evening at the board meeting as well, and so community members are welcome to please attend. We would love more people to also be at our board meetings as well. So the community is always welcome to attend our board meetings. That'll be an official board meeting that's noticed with the opportunity for public comment.
Is the agenda out already for the board meeting?
Not yet.
I just wanted to go back just a little bit to the class sizes. So you had mentioned that based on square footage of the classroom, that I think this was discussed at Madison, but is it potential that you could possibly have 40 kids and 2 teachers in one classroom?
That's how the physical layout of Walker has been intentionally designed for many years, right? And so, yes, those classrooms, we took out a wall in between what were 2 separate classrooms so that they could be combined classrooms. So that's why that's possible. It's actually 2 classrooms by square footage per student, 2 certified educators, additional support staff in those rooms. The walls were removed and they co-teach and team teach. They found that to be quite impactful for students.
I my kids go to Hoover, and we have quite a few classrooms that are outside. And I was really concerned as well, and I know my kids went to Jefferson before this, and they used some things. And I can just say that it has its drawbacks. It sounds scary at first.
Oh, I know. I mean, my daughter goes here and she's in the global classroom and there's a lot of kids in there.
Right.
It's really not great.
Well, I
So
think
my thought of that happening in many, many, many other classrooms just doesn't really sound really good shirt.
I was just saying that it's worked out for a lot of teachers. I've seen it work where some kids respond better to one teacher than the other teacher, and it just works for them.
And I think maybe it could possibly teach an issue also, but I mean, given the experience of the last 3 years here, I mean, just isn't something that I think
Last question. What is like the line about?
You can email your questions as well if you get home and you think, oh, I wish I would have asked this, or if you dig into those maps or things like that, and you come up with another question that you might have based on what you see in that information. You can also email us as well, and the email addresses are in the presentation, right, Amanda, or in the,
I will add email addresses to this presentation, so you can access.
yeah, so then we can get you back your answers. We're trying to answer those as quickly as we can.
Thank you for sharing some time with us this evening. Come to the board meeting June 6th if you're interested. It's also, we broadcast those live, so you can also watch online. And we'll see what steps we take next. So again, thanks for coming.
And there is a Q&A session online tomorrow that will be available. So if you think of a question, if you want to ask it, it'll be a virtual one that we are scheduled from. That was going to be online. So if there's someone who wasn't here and wants to ask a question, there's no presentation. It's just if you have a question, you want to ask.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great evening.